This episode of Mike Plays RP-1 will see the designing and launching of my first V2 rocket in an attempt to capture our first photographs from space. At 15 times the mass of anything launched previously, this rocket represents a significant step forward in my ability to lift payloads. This episode will also see the first launch of the XASR-1 sounding rocket, an upgraded cousin to the WAC Corporal seen previously in this series. In addition, I'll be taking a detailed look at RP-1's budget screen and how your reputation impacts your bottom line. Let's get started. We'll start off with the fourth launch of the WAC Corporal, the rocket that first crossed the Kármán line and entered into space. Launched from Launch Complex 1, while the much larger Launch Complex 2 works on the V2 rocket, the WAC is very cheap to keep flying. Here, all it's after is collecting more temperature and pressure scans from the upper atmosphere. Though now routine, this launch does mark the final flight of 1951 and also the likely final flight of the WAC Corporal itself, as the soon-to-be-completed post-war rocketry tech node will allow the upgrading of this rocket's engine, making it more capable. Anyway, this flight saw the pressure scan science completed, though there is still more to collect from the biome-specific temperature scans. But before we get on to further launches, there's some administrative stuff to look at, including something left over from the conclusion of last episode. That episode saw Evelyn Wolf break a crewed altitude record of 15 kilometers, which earned me 7 new leaders. But upon entering the administrative building after the conclusion of the mission, I didn't see those leaders anywhere. Based upon the names that were on the list, I'm assuming they were potential flight directors, but in order to have that position available, I have to achieve a crewed altitude of 25 kilometers or research the survivability tech node. This is clearly something for later, as soon after the conclusion of the mission, the construction of my second launch complex was complete, and it was going to require some staff to build my new V2 rocket. I have 20 engineers, and after assigning half of them to Launch Complex 2, the V2 wasn't scheduled to be completed until 1958, more than 6 years from now. At this point, I noticed that this bigger launch complex had a maximum staff of 61 rather than the 10 that I can assign to LC1, so throwing caution to the wind, I hired 45 new engineers. After maxing out the staff of LC2, the completion date for the V2 moved to just over a year from now, though you'll be seeing it later in this episode. The remaining 4 engineers kept working on the WAC Corporal you saw fly just a few moments ago, leaving no one working in the hangar for now. After that rocket flight, I came back to the KCT maintenance window in an effort to really get my head around this, starting with the research queue. I played around with the order in which the tech is being researched, paying close attention to the research rates, but noticing that, as you shifted the positions, those rates, as well as the color of the circles, changed. I still don't really get this. If you do, kindly leave a comment below the video, but I put the tech in what I thought was a sensible order, with post-war rocketry testing, the node that gives me a stack of engine upgrades, at the top. I wanted to look more closely at budgets too. Hovering over the reputation at the top of the screen, I could see that reputation controls your subsidy level, but reputation decays over time. I think this is a really clever use of this resource. It motivates the player to keep doing new missions, earning good press, and increasing the money coming your way. But that good press naturally dwindles if you don't do much over a period of time. With my current 29 reputation, I'm receiving an average annual subsidy of 32,605 Kerbal. Neat. Pressing the RP-1 button on the menu gets you your budget screen. The numbers in brackets are expenses. It's important to note that these represent staff salaries and building maintenance costs. They do not include the costs of building crafts or making upgrades. You can really dig into the details of the budget if you want, but you can get a summary by just hovering over funds at the top of the screen. The short of it is that I am up 61,325 funds for the year. This gave me the confidence to hire 15 more researchers and 4 more engineers, the latter of which I assigned to the hangar to begin rebuilding the MiG trainer that was destroyed last episode. I also noticed this training button for the first time. I can use it to give my astronauts something to do while on the ground. This seems to have no costs, but has the benefit of pushing back the astronauts' retirement dates. At the time of this recording, an update for RP-1 has just dropped, and one of the things it changes is how this training works. As such, it may be a better topic for a future episode. In the meantime, all those researchers are going to have post-war rocketry testing unlocked before the end of the year. So I thought now would be a good time to take a look at the engine upgrades I'll soon be having. The engine upgrades are found in the Engine GUI, which is open from the Engine's context menu. As you can see, I can't purchase these yet, but I can build and test rockets using them. With the Aerobee, I have 2 available, the XASR-1 and the AJ-10-27. The first provides a thrust and ISP improvement, while the second adds significantly to the rated burn time. I assume both are unlocked by the upcoming tech node, but actually only the XASR-1 will be, but not knowing this, I selected the AJ-10-27. Either way, to get the new engine to work, you have to remove all tanks under the Real Fuels tab and then refill them based on the new engine configuration. The higher thrust this engine has will have it burn through propellant faster, not to mention that the rated burn time has increased from 47 to 52 seconds. As such, it needs a lot more fuel, and the easiest way to accomplish that is by just making the fuel tank longer. You may recall that this tank was previously tooled, and that changing its dimensions will come at a cost, but just changing the length of a tank is not expensive, though changing the diameter is. So if you can get away with just making your rocket longer, do so. I increased the length until I had enough fuel to burn for 55 seconds, and when simulated, once again coupled with the Tiny Tim booster, it reached a pretty impressive altitude. I thought I was all set until I realized that this rocket exceeded the 1-ton mass limit of Launch Complex 1. I could upgrade the complex to have a 2-ton limit, but then it would have a 1-ton mass minimum, and I wouldn't be able to launch my old WAC Corporals anymore. I really considered doing the upgrade anyway, but in the end, I removed the Tiny Tim booster from the AJ-10-27, which brought it under the 1-ton limit. Because of the height of this rocket, I still had to do a complex upgrade, but that upgrade was faster, cheaper, and didn't introduce a minimum rocket size. And am I glad I didn't do the bigger upgrade, because after unlocking post-war rocketry testing and time warping to the completion of the renovation, I discovered I didn't have access to the AJ-10-27 anyway. So instead, I purchased the XASR-1 upgrade, which, with its lower thrust and burn time, needed a smaller rocket under which the Tiny Tim could fit and still remain under the 1-ton mass limit for the launch complex. By the way, the launch complex upgrade I did do would have been necessary anyway. So, after a quick simulation and tooling my new tank dimensions, my new sounding rocket was handed over to the engineers, who were scheduled to bang it off in just a few months, well ahead of the V2, which, at this point, was designed 6 months ago and still being built. One thing I missed in all this was that there is an upgrade available for the Tiny Tim too. Definitely something for the future, but right now, it's time for the inaugural launch of the XASR-1. And nice, okay. There are 2 milestone contracts within reach of this rocket. One to achieve an uncrewed altitude record of 140 kilometers, and the other to break a speed record of 1,500 meters per second. Although the engine performed nominally, my speed was just shy of what was required. That said, the altitude was plenty high enough, and 140 kilometers is an important milestone, as that is the altitude at which you can start collecting near-space science. So all 3 experiments aboard clicked on, collecting some fresh science for me. On the way down, it finished off the high altitude temperature science over the forest. There are still shores and water I could collect, but for that I would need to angle the rocket like you saw with the WAC Corporal earlier. Of course, that would mean a lower maximum altitude, and I decided there was more to gain from maximizing my time in near space, so after the conclusion of this mission, I simply let the staff of LC-1 crank out another identical to this one, and in 2 months' time, the next SASR-1 was ready to fly. And although I didn't make any changes between these two launches, there are always small variations in how long the engine is going to run for, and this time it ran long enough for the rocket to break the 1500 meter per second threshold. This also meant that this launch reached a higher altitude, maxing out at just shy of 150 kilometers. Combined, the two missions spent over 2.5 minutes in near space, collecting 4.4 science. Remember, these are cheap to build. You are sure to see more of them in the future, but right now, it's time to get to that V2 rocket, starting off with looking at the contract it is to perform. Launch a rocket with an early film camera above 100 kilometers and cover a downrange distance of 200 kilometers, then return the film camera. So you got to reach a 100 kilometer altitude, a 200 kilometer downrange distance with the film camera, and then recover the sample. Note as well that it also says to maintain sufficient avionics for the first 50 seconds of flight. Do not lose control. That means that the science core that I've been using on all my rockets today won't do. Instead, I have to use the near Earth core for my avionics. Another design constraint on this build is that the early film camera is a 1.25 meter part, which immediately means I'm going to need a much bigger rocket than anything you've seen thus far in this series. I started with the avionics part, under which went a procedural tank and then the mighty A4 rocket motor. Of course, the A4 engine is what powered the notorious V2 rocket. Designed by Wernher von Braun, starting in September 1944, the Nazis aimed over 3,000 of these at Allied cities, most notably Antwerp, Belgium, and London, England, killing thousands. Near the war's end, von Braun surrendered to the advancing Americans and would soon become a chief architect in their rocket program. Back to the build, I made sure the avionics was set to near Earth and then tweaked the shape of the cone until it looked okay, this time opting for the Pete No.1 variant of the smooth cone. There will be more things to check with avionics momentarily, but for now I set the fuel tank to the same 1.25 meter diameter and gave it an arbitrary length for now, and then filled it with the necessary propellants, ethanol, liquid oxygen, and high test peroxide, the last of which is a catalyst for the reaction. Looking at the engine stats, note the 239 kilonewtons of launch thrust compared to the measly 12 kilonewtons I got from the XASR-1 that you just saw. Also note the 70 seconds of rated burn time, and that, unlike the Aerobee family of engines, the fuel tank does not need to be pressurized. I then got to work on a trio of tail fins. This is the first rocket that I will have control of after launch, so I left room on the bottom of the tail fins for some control surfaces to allow me to steer the rocket. At this time, this is the only means of attitude control that I have. Unlike in the stock game, reaction wheels are still a ways off on the tech tree. I wanted to make some kind of housing for the engine. I grabbed a procedural structure part, changed its shape to cone, made it long enough to house most of the engine, and then increased the diameter of the top until the engine was inside. I then decreased the diameter of the bottom to give it a tapered look. This meant changing the fuel tank to cone as well, with the diameter of the bottom to match the housing, and a 1.25 meter diameter on the top to match the payload. I then attached my tail fins to the housing, tweaking their positions until I was happy with them. I'm only at 27 seconds of burn time, well under the 70 seconds this engine is rated for, but I do have over 2,000 meters per second of delta V, which is more than the WAC Corporal, which crossed the Kármán line a couple of episodes back. You may also be noticing that I'm no longer using Kerbal Engineer to get these vessel stats. The Delta V stats window, along with this vessel info window, is provided by McJeb. Apparently, Kerbal Engineer can cause problems with RP-1, so I decided to uninstall it. A couple of last things before our first test. I have to set how much controllable mass the avionics can handle. This will affect the cost and mass of the part. I set it to 6 tons, a little more than the vessel's current mass. It'll be easy enough to change later if the rocket happens to get bigger. I also changed the amount of electric charge to 100 units. Again, this is easy to change later should I need to. To lock this in, I pressed apply, preserving the dimensions of the cone that I made. Finally, this engine requires launch clamps in order to work. There are a number of options, including the stock launch clamps, but I decided to go with the medium launch clamps that come with AlphaMensae's modular launch pads. And with that, it was time for our first test flight. So far so good, but at my first attempt to steer the rocket, but all told, a promising start. I tweaked the fins and control surfaces a bit, and decided that I'll start with just getting the thing to fly straight up before worrying about getting the downrange distance I need. I also installed a thermometer and barometer in the avionics package and turned all the science on, making sure not to forget the early film camera too. I increased the length of the fuel tank a bit with each simulation, soon having to up the controllable mass of the avionics to 10 tons, until I achieved an altitude of 137 kilometers. Then came trying to get the thing to pitch over. I tried working with the ascent guidance McJeb provides, but this is really designed to put a rocket into orbit, and I couldn't see how to get the ascent profile to be steep enough. I tried flying manually, but found my most consistent results came when I simply tilted the rocket over in the VAB and locked it to prograde once it picked up a good head of steam. Another option would be a simple KOS script, something I may consider for future launches. Remember, I need a downrange distance of 200 kilometers. You can monitor this with the flight recorder provided by McJeb, but I found the simplest thing was to monitor it using the contracts window itself. To make sure everyone is aware, this larger contracts window is coming from the mod Contracts Window Plus, which is not part of the RP-1 package and has to be installed separately. There were some rocket oscillations that were a result of the SAS overcompensating. This was fixed by simply turning down the pitch, yaw, and roll to 25%. Of course, the more I pitch over, the lower my max altitude. At one point, it dipped below the necessary 100 kilometers, but I fixed that by just turning up the tank utilization to the full 83%, increasing the amount of fuel it holds. It was this iteration of the rocket that was able to both achieve the required 100 kilometer altitude and the 200 kilometer downrange distance. Next was to get the second stage of this mission working, recovering the film camera. This started by adding the stack parachute provided by the RealChute mod. After installing the part, you get a message that to configure RealChute parts, you need to open action groups followed by clicking on the part. I set the number of spare chutes to 1, though perhaps that should be 0, and then noticed that the calculations for the size of the chute was based upon the current craft mass. I only planned to recover the camera and avionics, so I removed the bottom end of the rocket and then reopened the parachute GUI. Other than that, I just kept everything else on the default and hit apply settings. I then added a procedural ring decoupler, changing the diameter to 1.25 meters to match the payload. After that came my final simulation, just to make sure it separated cleanly and that the parachutes worked. Everything went as expected, except I got 2 parachutes instead of 1. To me that seems unnecessary, but for some inexplicable reason, all I did was change the pre-deployment altitude of the primary chute to 12 kilometers and left the secondary chute at its default 5 kilometers. I have no explanation as to what I was thinking here. The rest of this was just prettying it up, using the built-in textures and recoloring GUI. At a height of 12.4 meters and a mass of 8.4 tons, this rocket was well beyond the capacity of Launch Complex 1, and, as I showed you with the XASR-1 earlier in this video, you can't up the maximum mass without also upping the minimum. If I wanted to keep launching my Aerobee family of rockets, I needed to build a second launch complex. To do this, just click New LC. Numbers are automatically generated for the mass and dimension limits based upon the current vessel. Don't worry too much about being perfect here, as they are easy to upgrade later, but figuring this rocket will likely be the smallest of this family, I upped the mass limit to 11 tons, giving me an 8-ton minimum, which is just under the mass of this rocket. Note that this means, without building another complex, I cannot launch rockets with masses between 1 and 8 tons. Not including upkeep and staff salaries, the new construction was going to cost 9,377 funds and take 86 days to complete. As well, with all these new 1.25 meter parts, the tooling cost was 16,502 funds. And lest we forget, it took the engineers of LC2 almost 9 months to get this thing built. But build it they did, bringing us to this lovely midsummer day of 1952. Well, for the first time, SAS can come on, throttle up, we'll get ready. Now we do have to wait for the engine to spool up here, so we're going to fire our engine. And we're off. And what I like to do, I'm just going to hold this until the prograde vector kind of gets close in here, so it gets some speed, and then we'll lock it onto prograde, and from here on I'm not doing anything. I'm just going to let this go. This marks my 7th consecutive successful launch. I don't want to jinx anything, but I've yet to have an engine failure, and I'm beginning to feel like I'm due. Failures do set you back. You just have to use up the time and resources to just build another rocket. Okay, we are out of fuel. Engine ran nominally, which is always exciting. And we should be, in this case, collecting samples once this guy is ready to go. But it's still in an invalid situation. Going now. It is running now. We also, of course, do still have. So our planetary, that takes 10 minutes to collect what we can. Except this is not going to be transmitted. This is being collected as a sample. It's filling up a sample slot built into the camera. And if you notice, it's not sticking to the prograde vector anymore, but that's because the air is too thin for our control surfaces to work. Remember, there are no reaction wheels yet. And once we get them, they will not be as powerful as what you're used to in the stock game. We have achieved the necessary altitude. We're more than halfway through our necessary downrange distance. We've done 2 slots. Still 1 slot available. Collecting photographs, taking pictures. And perhaps today it may seem a bit strange that this is a sample and needs to be recovered, but this isn't a digital age, and transmitting something like a television signal took a lot of equipment. You're not going to put that on top of a rocket. No, these pictures are on film, and that film needs to be collected. Of course, we're still collecting other science which can be transmitted, especially temperature scans over different biomes. There's our water. We've got 50% of the water collected, and we're going to get a little bit more still because this is still hot. Now we're starting to get some attitude control. The air has now gotten thick enough. It's locking itself onto the prograde vector. We have achieved a necessary downrange distance. So what I think I'm going to do, see if I can flip this on retrograde. Is it going to do that for us? No, it likes it the way it is. So I'm going to, we are slowing down. So let's let this slow down a little more. Before we detach our payload. Oh, jeez. Did an emergency stage as soon as the explosion started happening there. I think I got really lucky not losing the payload on all of that. Anyway, everything seems good now. How'd we do for science? 50% of the over the water, a little more than 50% actually. From our planetary photography, we have flying high over shore. There's still a lot more we could collect here, as you can see. But this is not Oh, there goes our parachute. One thing to notice here is how there is no value in the R&D center because we have to recover this stuff. So this, what we've got on flight, is not counted until we have recovered this. And of course, that is our last requirement for our contract. Of course, that's contingent on the parachutes doing their job. Because of the dumb way I set up RealChutes, the second chute didn't deploy until an altitude of 5 kilometers, and then both fully deployed at around the 1 kilometer mark. Back in the day, they wouldn't let this hit the ground at all. The Air Force would come by with a jet carrying specially designed hooks and would just scoop this up. Hopefully before the Ruskies had a chance to get their hands on it, because we have sensitive military intelligence on this thing of the water just off of Florida. Either way, after making it down to the ocean surface, the recovery went without incident. On top of the science that was transmitted, we also got photographs flying high over the shores and over the water for an additional 1.3 science. As for the contract, it says here, excellent! Both the media and our scientists will be excited to see these lovely shots. 42 reputation, bringing our current reputation up to 72.3, which translates to an annual subsidy of 41,541 Kerbucks, getting us a budget surplus of 53,833. Gotta start thinking about spending this money as well as picking up a new contract. That is all going to have to be for the next episode. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you then.